Good morning, photography. Today we are going to talk a little bit more about exposure controls. We've already reviewed a little bit of this in class, but we're going to go a little bit more in depth. So at the end of this assignment, you guys are going to be reflecting back on and answering some questions about the 3 exposure controls that you can control on your camera. You need to be able to explain how aperture affects exposure and depth of field, and ultimately you need to figure out what kind of light meter you have in your camera and how to use it. Okay, we are going to talk a little bit more about f-stops and depth of field, and what is depth of field and how can we use it to create more interesting photographs. So the 3 things that you are going to be really reflecting on in this class in terms of exposure control are your film speed, shutter speed, and aperture. Now, film speed, I have already determined this for you, okay? You are going to be using 400 speed film. So that is your ISO or your ASA. They mean the same thing. One's international, one's American. The shutter speed we talked about a little bit when we were going over the parts of the camera, and that's how quickly or slowly that black little trap door on the back of your camera when it's open, that little black trap door that is your shutter, how fast or slow it is opening and allowing light to expose the film. And then your aperture. We were looking at our aperture on the bulb setting of our cameras, and that is where we were talking about big numbers mean little things, and the size of the hole in your lens allowing a lot of light in or a little bit in. So we should have already done this step where you were looking for wherever you had the ASA or ISO indicator, and this is just a graphic we got online, let's be honest. So you guys are actually using 400 film, okay? So make sure that you have set your camera to 400 film. The higher the film number, the more sensitive it is to light, okay? But it would also have more grain. And again, this is just review of changing your ISO or your ASA. Okay, shutter speed, we're going to go a little bit more in depth with that. If you want to be able to capture fast motion, you have got to have a fast shutter speed, okay? Remember, we played around with this a little bit, the back of our camera, and changing our shutter speed, and I just call it the trapdoor because sometimes it makes a little bit more sense when there's all of these new technical terms being thrown around. But how fast that is actually opening and shutting. You want a really, really fast shutter speed if you're trying to capture motion. However, if you want to be a little bit more creative and artistic and blur your image intentionally, then we want a slow shutter speed. The other thing that we need to think about with shutter speed is lighting, okay? So sometimes you're going to have to prioritize your shutter speed just because of the light. So if we were in a low light situation, like indoors, and I know inside the classroom seems like it's pretty well lit, but that fluorescent light is not that great, and you're probably going to see that you have to have a slower shutter speed, like a 60th of a second or 1/25th of a second, okay? That means that trapdoor, that shutter, is going to be open longer, allowing more light in, okay? And remember that we talked about on our shutter speed control that many of us had numbers that were in red or an X that was red to remind us that 1/60th of a second is the slowest we can hand hold our camera. Other than that, we would need to use like a stabilizing technique with our hands, which we're going to learn, or use a tripod. In this graphic, you can kind of see some examples of different shutter speeds. Remember, with 1/60th of a second, that's what we just mentioned, anything lower than that, your object is going to blur. Okay, so you might be wanting to do that intentionally, or you may not. Okay, so you can see an object in motion. The slower that the subject is moving, the more blurring effect that we get. Okay, now when we look at this image, you can see this was a very fast shutter speed in comparison to 1/4 of a second, a slow shutter speed. Okay, where we get a little bit more creative interest going on here with the blurring of the lights, or in this next example, creative use of slow shutter speed. Moving objects can create some really interesting blurred effects with that slow shutter speed. This dancer, or you, the photographer, being stationary and looking at a stationary object, you can see the people walking by are blurred, or here at the train. Okay, so this is something that you definitely want to master and learn and understand, because you're going to want to be able to be creative with your shutter speed, but also think about the types of lighting situations that you're in at night, having a slower shutter speed, or at daytime, having a little bit higher shutter speed. Now, your camera is smart and it's going to help you figure that out a little bit, okay? So all different kinds of light meters, ultimately it is your responsibility to figure out how the heck your light meter works in your own camera. So the next couple of slides are just some examples of the different types of light meters that are commonly found in manual cameras. So again, this is your responsibility to figure out how your individual light meter works. And I'm just flipping through a few of these. This is actually how my camera works. When it's out of sync, there will be 2 red lines, and once I get the right setting between aperture and shutter speed, there will only be 1 line and it will be green. Okay, so look that up in your manuals if you haven't already. Everybody's going to be doing a checkpoint with me to show me how your shutter speed, aperture, and light meter work. Now we're going to talk a little bit about lenses. Your cameras may or may not have come with some additional lenses for you to use. So this is just a little FYI. Okay, some of those bigger telephoto lenses are going to allow you guys to be able to zoom in and get much greater distance. Right now, most of you have a lens that is 35mm or 55mm. Okay, so the bigger the lens, the farther back you're able to see in focus. And one of the connections that we need to be making with our lens is the aperture. So again, big numbers mean little things. Here's an f/16. You can see that that's a really small aperture versus an f2, which is really, really wide open, okay? Not only is that going to play into how much light is getting into our camera, but it's also going to play into the depth of field. And the depth of field is how much is in focus with your image. How much is in focus. They are adjusting these different f-stops all the way from 2 to maybe 16 or even 22. It's essentially having or doubling the amount of light that is able to enter into the camera. And here are just a couple of different diagrams that you guys, whatever makes sense to you, use that, okay? All right, here you can see some f-stops affecting the exposure of the image. So this is a really, really wide open lens versus a smaller aperture. But with a really, really wide open lens here, we need a faster shutter speed because that opening, that hole is so big, a lot of light is able to enter into the camera. So the shutter needs to close a lot faster versus if we had a slower shutter, you can see that that is overexposed. We have way too much light coming in versus over here, a very, very small opening, an f11 at 2/50th of a second is going to be too dark. Okay, so we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about this because there's going to be various combinations that you can create with f-stops and shutter speeds, and you can see along this diagonal line to get a correct exposure. So depth of field, as we are moving forward again, is allowing you to get a lot in focus or a little in focus. So you can see the higher the number, again, big numbers mean small things, the more you're able to get in. You have a longer focal range versus a large aperture of a 2.8. You can't get a whole lot in focus. And here are a few examples of different f-stops with different focal ranges. So an f16 you can see here, you can get a lot in focus all the way to an f4 you don't have a great depth of field. One thing that you might want to consider though is how you might use a shallow depth of field, a larger aperture like an f1.4 or a 2.8 to get more emphasis on your subject matter, okay? So you can see there's a lot of texture and everything going on in the background. This is kind of a nice way to bring more emphasis to your focal point. And we've talked already that a lot of cameras now have a portrait setting that allows you to have that kind of shallow depth of field. So different ways you can control the depth of field to create further emphasis. So depth of field is the focal range of your lens, okay? How much in the background is going to be out of focus or in focus, okay? And here are just a couple more examples of different focal lengths and depth of field, okay? So at this point, this is just kind of an overview. If you want to pull up the PowerPoint and follow along on your own, there are a couple of questions that I would like you to respond to individually.